welcome to the latest in our series of one-to-one conversations with Safaraz Ali of the Pathway Group. And on this occasion, we're going to talk about something which we hear such a lot of, particularly in the context of business. We're going to talk about culture. We're going to talk about culture in terms of the way that it impacts upon business. We're going to talk about national culture. We're going to talk about ethnic culture. But first of all, I think, Saf, what we need to do is to start by defining what we mean by culture. When somebody talks about the culture of a business or the culture of a community or an ethnic culture, what do you understand it to mean?
Okay, firstly, always good to see you, always good to meet with you, Adrian. It's fantastic again, and I've got the privilege of just having a one-to-one with you, which is a great thing. It's a very large topic, an all-encompassing topic. So again, congratulations on picking such a wide and diverse topic as well. In terms of culture, I feel it is a bit of a buzzword at this moment in time. A lot of people are talking about culture in terms of business. And for me and for a while, it's been, in terms of our organization, how people do things when nobody's watching. It's about definitely the values of the organization, the beliefs, and effectively how we do things. And every business is different. Often it's not written, it's just how we do things here, as people say. But you find that there's an element of culture that's cultivated. So Netflix culture is something that I've written about, and they're making it very simple. It's about trust. It's about enabling people, and what they've said is, you can have policies and procedures. Say, for expenses, you can have 3 pages of policies on expenses, what you can claim, what you can't claim. Netflix on the other side have said, actually, just do whatever is in the best interest of Netflix. We trust you to do that. So every organization will look at their values, their beliefs, and cultivate a way of doing things.
So it's almost a kind of DNA, isn't it? It's something that we kind of inherit and that evolves over time, and it's the core of any business or any individual. Do you agree?
Very difficult to measure in some cases. I mean, even though there's consultants out there which talk about measuring culture and looking at it and going in between, but it is something that happens over a period of time. It is, in my view, again from a leadership perspective, it comes from the top, and you start from people, from recruiting people, in terms of how their job descriptions are written, how their sort of performance managed, how they do things effectively, target-wise, and there's a range of things. It's not, in my view, about playing table tennis on a weekend, or it's not about having a set of furniture or as I said, a ping pong table or table tennis. It's much more than that.
Yeah. And I mean, I suppose a lot of people, I don't know if you'd agree with this, you tell me, don't fail to make the distinction between culture and behaviour. Let me give you an example of that. If you put up a speed camera, the likelihood is that when people see that speed camera, they'll change the behaviour and they'll drive slower. But that doesn't fundamentally change the culture in terms of whether they're reckless or fast drivers. I mean, is that a fair analogy? You can change behaviour quite readily, but culture is incredibly difficult to change, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's a saying about we are a combination of the people that we hang around with or we spend time with. So I think that's a big factor in terms of the community you're working with or so forth. And it's also about norms and set norms. So, these sort of things are people, if it's partly to do with how people perceive things and see things. It's like reticular activation system. You start noticing these things and you start behaving in a particular way. That's not necessarily everything. What is a culture? It might change some people's views and bring them to the community norms or the business norms. But as I said, it's a huge topic, and
we're going to explore in a little while ethnic culture. But first of all, I'd like to know whether you believe that there is such a thing as a national culture. Let me give you an example. I mean, a lot of people talk about the American way of doing business. The sort of popular perception is that the American way of doing business is very go ahead, very entrepreneurial, and you have a go at doing something, and if it goes wrong you shrug your shoulders and you try again, and then if that doesn't work you shrug your shoulders and try again, brush yourself down and have a go at something else until you find something that works. A, do you agree that there is an American way of doing things, and B, what's your feeling of that way of doing business?
Very similar to language. It evolves, it changes, and there's a number of things that make that change happen. And what you'll find is that it's never at a particular point. So there's a number of things that can change it in terms of British culture. There's no doubt that the people within immigration does affect it. How we view things does affect it in terms of the fact that we're seeing international programs. We're seeing programs from not just America, which has been there for years, but also from Europe, and how we get our news, how we get our information, social media. All of these things affect our culture, affect our language, and I think the two for me, just the way language evolves, culture, particularly culture within a country, does change. In terms of American culture, I see that as an American dream in terms of entrepreneurialism and going and doing something with your life, and actually particularly it's a success story, but that success story is across the country, across the world effectively. In terms of failure and failing, slightly romanticized. There's a lot of talk about people failing as a good thing, and I've seen videos on failure. People talk about failure, fail fast, fail forward, fail often. And failure, there's two things with failure. If it's absolute, if it's a failure where the business has just died and there's an implication for it, then that's absolute failure in one aspect. If it's failure which is, where you can actually brush yourself down and you're testing, if I was a scientist, I would be talking about experiments. I would be saying that's an experiment. And if I was maybe, if maybe in another trade, I would be maybe talking about pilots. And if it's in that context, in terms of a pilot or experiment or, a survey or just testing things out, then that's not failure. That's actually getting you to a position where you're actually getting better, you're learning from it, and you're improving it, and then it's constant improvement, it's innovation, it's improvement. But then there's another part which is again failure in absolute terms, where something has failed, maybe a company, an organization has failed for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm. And I think what you're saying, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, of course, is that failure is part and parcel of life, and we all have to learn to fail because it's the way that we learn most of the time. But reckless failure, the attitude that, okay, if I fail, I'll start something else tomorrow, is not victimless. If a business fails, then there are implications for the people that work for that business, there are implications for customers, there are implications for suppliers, people don't get paid, and that has ramifications like throwing a pebble into a pond. They can go quite deep and they can go quite a long way. So I think you're saying, and tell me if I'm wrong, that it's okay to fail, and that will happen from time to time, but we shouldn't take a cavalier attitude to failure, because we should understand that impacts upon a lot of lives in a very serious and often important way. Is that fair? Okay.
From a personal perspective, failure, again, I've often heard people talk about failure or fail as first attempt in learning. So it's their first attempt in learning, and it's a continuous process. Then you can take it away from that and talk about an organization failing, even economies, countries failing, and whether that should be allowed and whether that should be something that we should harness and protect. And I think you can go the other way in terms of protectionism, and other way in terms of subsidies. And unfortunately for me, I think the country has gone through that process where there's been too much protectionism. There's been subsidies. There's been an element of where organisations really their purpose has changed, the world has changed, and we've been trying to safeguard certain things on the basis that we can't deal with the consequences. Sometimes it's necessary as part of evolving and changing. You know, you're from the media profession. Print media has completely changed, and then you can't keep it to what it is, and it's got to evolve and it's got to change. So it's in the context of the world. It's in the context of, you know, things do change, and for that change to happen, unfortunately, some organisations do need to fail. There is a consequence to it, and I'm not saying that consequence is easily digestible. There is always people behind it, but it's also life itself.
But would you agree that sometimes an organisations fail, a small business, a medium-sized business, a manufacturing business fails and life moves on? But, you know, let's talk about the best example in the last decade of businesses that failed in a horrendous way, and yet they've been subsidised and they've been propped up by government, by you, by me, by other ordinary people, and that's in the banking sector. Now, the banking sector failed. Many people would say that capitalism failed in 2008, and yet those businesses were subsidised, they were kept going. Many would say that there was no alternative but to do that. But don't you feel that attitudes to subsidisation are a little bit unfair sometimes, in that, you know, should the banks have been allowed to fail? What would have been the consequences of that? And unless they had been allowed to fail, because they'd not been allowed to fail, they've not really significantly changed, have they? There have been some minor changes here and there. They've been a bit more careful with the capital, etc. But essentially the banking sector has a reckless culture because it knows that it's too big to fail. Would you agree with that?
I would say that's not the case at this moment in time. I'm, as you know, from that particular sector, and that sector had a fantastic reputation in terms of becoming a banker or working in financial services. You know, what our understanding has been is that it's been very much sales driven in terms of customer facing. So you've had financial advisors, you know, a culture of sales and sales driven, and, you know, you've had pensions mis-selling, you've had mortgage mis-selling, you've had various types of activities that have unfortunately have caused damage to their reputation, but also financial damage as well. But then on the other side, you've had financial derivatives and various other things for tools that they've used to grow, and where the economy was able to grow as a result of that leverage. The failure really has come from a risk perspective in terms of managing that risk and understanding what that is. And what you find now is the sectors who regulate understanding much better. So what you find is that compliance is probably the top of the agenda for most banks now, for most financial institutions, and there's a lot of people putting brakes on certain things in terms of what they can do, what they can't do. I don't think, personally speaking, that sector has recovered from that reputation, and it will take years and years. I mean, we've 12 years now from the start of the credit crunch and the financial implications, and that so anybody who's a banker now says it in with an element of regret to a certain level, but at the same time you've got to think it's that sector which has allowed businesses to grow. It's a sector which is encourage growth. I mean, there's a lot of banks now that are working with SME businesses that are there in terms of encouraging growth within that sector. So there's always another side to it.
Yeah, I don't. Okay, we won't let the banking financial sector dominate this discussion, but I think I do need to pick up on a couple of those points that you've made. The damage that's been caused has been enormous. You know, most people are poorer than they were 10 years ago. If I wanted to borrow £10,000 from the bank, I would be charged an interest rate, even with interest rates low as they are now, probably something between 2 and 4%. If I've got savings in my bank of £10,000, I will be paid 0.1% interest. It's grossly unfair, isn't it? And it's grossly unfair because it is a culture in which a group of greedy people have basically been educated to understand that they cannot fail.
You mentioned that before as well about them being too big to fail. I don't think that's the actual case in terms of I think there's lessons that have been learned in terms of the margin between savings rate and bank borrowing rate. Those margins have increased. Definitely they've increased, where the margins were a lot lower before. But as you probably know, most of the borrowings aren't actually from people's savings, and the two don't align necessarily. So it's really about borrowings from the marketplace. It's not savings is a very small amount of what actually is borrowed out, and if it was just based on that, there wouldn't be any borrowing, there wouldn't be any lending. And most of the money that's lent out is actually lent out from a different mechanism, and we're going into very, very much detail in terms of the banking.
We'll finish on that topic, but simply to just say that if everybody turned up at the bank tomorrow and said, "I want my money back, please,"
there wouldn't be.
The bank would be able to pay that 3% of what they have.
They couldn't do it.
We've talked about, to some degree, national culture. We've talked about culture in a particular sector, and we've chosen to focus, or I've chosen to focus, on the financial sector. Ethnic culture. You come from the Asian subcontinent, from that tradition. Tell me a little bit about the culture of business as seen from a British Asian perspective.
I take a probably slightly different view to most people. My view is that British Asians are not entrepreneurial. They are very much focused on professions. To this day, I've not heard a parent say to their son, "I want you to go into business." It's very much professional focused. It's very much academic driven, and it's pushing people down the route of a good job. Whatever that good job is, professionalism or whatever the case is, and that's been since I was at college and university, and I think that's still the case now. So that's the first preference for most people. Even if I was a business owner in a successful business, very rarely have I seen a business owner encourage their child to actually go into that business. And then what they'll say is that I'd rather you not come into this business because it's not an environment that gives you respect, or it's not an environment where it encourages growth for that individual. And I'd rather you go out and stand on your own 2 feet and get a professional job, whether that helps in terms of standing within the community per se, or whether that's something in terms of a wish or a goal. So from my perspective, I still disagree with people saying that Asians are very entrepreneurial. It's from back when I was born in Birmingham, and my father came into the UK back in the 1950s, and for him, because his grasp of English was very low, it was about education and about learning the language. It's about developing himself, and then he's been able to progress in his career because he's had to work very, very hard and had to work the long hours to actually progress in that career.
I mean, why do you think is it something to do with another perception which you may say is a misconception, that people, Asians and particularly people from an Indian heritage, tend to be very, very status driven? It's desperately important that my son, daughter goes to university and gets a degree, and I don't want them to do an apprenticeship because it doesn't hold the same level of status. I don't want them to go into business because it doesn't hold the same level of status as being a teacher or a doctor or whatever. I mean, is that fair?
There's elements of that. I've seen that. There's an element of we talked about environment, and the environment dictates really what that. In some cases, the individuals as well. So if you've got an environment which is about sort of professional jobs, about getting degrees and getting further qualifications and pushing you down that particular route, then that's what those individuals know. And I think the key is really understanding the pulse of that environment, but without actually letting that be your pulse. And I think that's the difference. And we sometimes do follow certain people or follow that community that we're in, that environment that we're in, without really thinking too much about it, without really understanding sort of a different perspective to it. Obviously, this is one of the reasons why we launched the Asian Apprenticeship Awards back in 2016. It was to educate, really, in one respect, parents and also young people in terms of the benefits of apprentices. In addition to business owners, a lot of business owners saw apprentices as cheap labour. So there was an element of a branding exercise, a sort of knowledge really is one of those areas that we try to sort of enhance the understanding of what apprentices are and the opportunities with regard to the apprenticeship route.
Let's take you back a few years. I'm sure it's not very many years at all, but to Safaraz Ali, the young man.
Yeah.
And you've left school. You've decided to go to university. I know you went to university in Birmingham, and I think I'm right in saying that you studied financial services.
Banking and financial services, yeah.
And then you became not a banker, but you worked in financial services. And I assume, you tell me, but I assume that your parents were quite pleased about that. I mean, what was their attitude when you decided that actually you wanted to go into business?
Okay. Just on that particular topic, my first choice in terms of my degree was a Bachelor in Science in Entrepreneurship. So I enrolled with what was the University of Central England. So, we had polytechnics before, which moving into universities, and University of Central England is now known as Birmingham City University. And at the time, we had new degrees, a lot of new sort of degrees coming into foray, and there was a Bachelor in Science in Entrepreneurship that I enrolled onto, and I had to unfortunately leave that within the first sort of 2 weeks to go on to banking. So banking wasn't my first choice, but what I wasn't able to do was persuade my father that this was a good thing. Entrepreneurship wasn't a common word at the time. 1992 wasn't a common word. I mean, there was no Dragon's Den, there was no apprentice, there was no real discussion of entrepreneurship. And if the best way I described telling my father about this degree was, it's about business, it's about small business. And I wasn't able to persuade or convey what that is. And he says, you're wasting your time with this. And if it's business that you want to do, why don't you just come and join me in my small shoe shop, which was on Coventry Road. And because of that particular pressure, and also at the same time, the actual university wasn't able to sell this to students as well. So nobody really wanted to do a Bachelor of Science in Entrepreneurship. So I then had the choice of either doing just business studies or this banking and financial services. And I thought banking, yes, I think I think there's opportunities there. And I thought it was a respectful profession, and I thought, yeah, this is something I did. And it wasn't, as I said, something that I thought of doing before I had to leave my Bachelor of Science in Entrepreneurship. So I did my 4 years in banking and financial services, and then followed the footsteps of actually compliance and working in that particular sector, and then decided that it is a business that I want to get into, and it is something that I want to set up on my own. So a little bit of background in terms of the degree and the.
And before we finally move off this topic, in this great game of chance that is life, had the chromosomes been different and had you been female, what would have been the expectation?
So I was as is my father. I was the first child that went into university, and that's not just in terms of my family, but also the immediate relatives that we had. So there was a lot of trust in my father as well, in terms of actually, in terms of it wasn't an obvious thing at that time, and it was an element of trust. Is an element of, is there going to be a yield? Is there going to be a return from this? My sister didn't go down that particular route. She's a lot younger than I am, but at that time she was given the same options as well. So it depends really on the family. My father was a big believer in education, and there's a phrase which I sort of acknowledged in my book, and he used this phrase, I want you to travel as far as China if it's to do with education, and that was the culture of education. In terms of his own perspective, he was, as far as I remember, he was always reading. He always had a newspaper, and he was actually getting private sort of classes for himself to better his command of English.
So your father would have been happy for your sister to follow the same kind of route that you do, had she wanted to do that. But that's not typical, is it, of people from your background, is it?
That's very generalized. Very generalized. I mean, in terms of the people that I'm directly associated with, I'm finding that there's more females, particularly from the Asian community, going into university. They're doing better in terms of school qualifications. They're doing better in terms of colleges, and they also seem to be more focused in terms of university and more focused in terms of career. So in terms of if I look at my nephews and my sort of immediate sort of generation of nephews and nieces, and I'm talking probably about 12, 15 people that come into that particular category, the ladies are doing extremely well. They're all sort of really focused. You ask them in terms of what they want to do, they know exactly what they want to do, what they want to achieve, really goal focused. And in my, again, direct experience, the young men seem to be less focused in terms of their career and what they want to do, and it seems to be more in terms of we'll see how it goes, and they're living each year as it is, where the ladies are sort of maybe 3-year plan, 5-year plan, and really want to achieve something in their lives.
I think many people would find that very, very encouraging, and I just want to finish because unfortunately time is short, but white males, particularly from working class, but perhaps not just from the working class, feel a sense of entitlement. They won't do jobs that people from other ethnic traditions will do. There's a sense of, I should have this purely because of what I am and where I come from. Not particularly entrepreneurial, not particularly hardworking. That's an incredible generalisation, I know. But any truth in it, in your experience?
I think it's a class within the population that is at the moment quite disadvantaged. It's an area where a lot of focus has gone into other areas and other communities, and this has been a community that's been left to the side. And it's a community that's now, in terms of various reports. I'm trying to think off the top of my head, Roundtree report and various others, where it's slightly underprivileged, slightly disadvantaged, and it's harder for that generation to get onto that step ladder. And what you're finding is that some political parties, some parts of the community are trying to exploit that. And it's a difficult conversation in terms of the roots of it and how it started, but it's I don't see it as individuals that are in a great position, and what you're finding is that they're underachieving in terms of qualifications, they're underachieving in terms of university places. So we did an exercise in terms of when we were looking at the Asian Apprenticeship Awards, and we looked at a comparison in terms of how many Asians going into university as opposed to the white indigenous population, and the Asian community was overrepresented. The black community was overrepresented as well, even though the misconception might be the fact that there's less blacks going into university, but they were overrepresented it as a university places. And unfortunately, the white, particularly from certain deprived backgrounds or deprived areas, there just wasn't that progression in terms of academic or in terms of professional.
To conclude, the impression that I get, and again, if I'm wrong, tell me, but that you're a man who believes in meritocracy. You're someone who believes that where people get in life should be based upon, as far as practically possible, equality of opportunity, based upon the character of the individuals, the willingness of the individuals to work hard. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I believe in, yes, of course I believe in equality, but it doesn't mean treating everybody the same. I think you need to be living in an output related system. It's about outcomes and deliverables. In terms of actually growth is the only way for an individual to grow and for an economy to grow. But saying that, I also believe there needs to be a floor in terms of protecting certain people. I don't believe there should be a ceiling in any shape or form. So where people talk about pay and curtailing pay, and why is this person paid this much, and the obscene sort of money that's an individual is paid, I think that's portraying it in a negative light. And it should be about encouraging people. It should be about encouraging people to grow and creating wealth, rather than putting sort of a ceiling or a glass sort of ceiling on the economy or individuals. And I think we should. You talked about the American culture. We should look at the American culture in a positive way, the fact that that's actually encouraged and they look up to that, rather than looking down on it or seeing it as obscene or wrong. And so it's getting that balance right, and I think it's the balance is everything, and how you get that balance. My personal view in terms of business, people portray business in a negative light. They talk about fat cats. They talk about the people sort of creaming off money, and particularly in terms of businesses being ruthless. And my view is that businesses, for them to survive, can't be ruthless. Can't be. They've got to have a purpose. We look at it in a way where entrepreneurship is positive, but business is negative. And I think we need to get that balance right. And hopefully. If the media and more, you see more TV programs, you might get a little bit more balance, but that's maybe a wishful thinking.
Safaraz, we could go on for a very, very long time, but a very, very long time we do not have. But thank you very, very much for being with us and sharing your thoughts on culture and entrepreneurship. And I'm sure we'll be back at some point in the future talking about another business-related topic, and I very much hope that you're able to join us. Thank you very much.